Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about a train robbery and buried loot. And this happened in Nebraska. So there was a young man named Duke Sherman, and he was a 17-year-old boy who left the Iowa farm, and he was destined to head to the big city for a little bit of that big city life. So he went to Omaha with the money that he had saved, but like everyone knows, money never goes as far as you hope it will. Well, this is what happened to this bright-eyed 17-year-old as he was soon out of money and looking for a job. So he did get a job at the Omaha Stockyards, and he had a lowly, menial job in his eyes of cleaning out livestock stalls and manure and cleaning a lot of things around the stockyard. And he was not too keen on the job. He didn't like it all that well. But it gave him money. But it never gave him enough money to go drinking or gambling with any of his friends or go do the things he thought were real fun. So Duke wanted something better. And he worked at this job for about a year. And he attempted to get jobs as, on wagon trains that were heading west, and it was usually the much older, more experienced riders. They always got those kind of jobs. He was just too young and too much of a greenhorn. So he was having no luck. He continued to work at the stockyards, and one evening, as he was hanging around the train depot, Duke overheard the telegraph operator and Ed Walls, who was the engineer of one of the trains. He heard them having a conversation, or kind of overheard them. And Walls told the telegraph operator, that was also his friend, it sounds like, that there was a shipment of gold worth about $60,000 that would be leaving on the morning express train. And it was destined for a bank in Lincoln, and it would be in metal boxes in the messenger car. So they had this conversation, and they were unaware that where Duke was at, he could hear this conversation going on. So this conversation, of course, was magic to Duke's ears. If he could get a hold of that kind of money, his money problems would be over. So Duke had that evening to come up with a plan. And about mid-morning the next day, the engineer, Walls, he was about 10 miles outside of Lincoln when he came across a herd of cattle, and a lot of them were on the tracks, and so he slowed the train down very slow, and he blew the train whistle, and he wanted to scare these cattle off of the tracks. And so he was going about 10 miles an hour at this point, and the cattle are slowly wandering away from the tracks. But Walls all of a sudden felt something jab him in the side. And he turned to face a bandit with a bandana over his face and a pistol jammed in his side. And of course, this was Duke. Duke told Walls to stop the train, which he eventually did. And then Duke had the engineer, Walls, escort him to the locked messenger car. But as they got there, the messenger had already opened the door to peer out and see why the train had stopped. Well, he may have seen the cattle and thought nothing of it until Duke appeared with a gun. And Duke threatened to kill the engineer if the engineer and the messenger did not toss those boxes of gold coins out onto the ground. So it sounds like Duke held a gun on the engineer, and the messenger handed boxes to the engineer, and they set them on the ground next to the train tracks for Duke. So now Duke had $60,000 now sitting beside the train tracks. He told the engineer to get back in the train and proceed to Lincoln, which he did. But as the train pulled away, the engineer Walls was looking out the window of the locomotive, and he saw Duke come from a stand of trees with a buckboard wagon and a horse. And he proceeded to load those heavy strong boxes into the wagon. As the train went around the bend, then Walls could no longer see Duke. But once Duke had this wagon loaded up and he had this single horse, he had a plan to head towards Central City, Nebraska, across the open prairie to the west. So it was said that Duke was seen by 3 people in Omaha when he had stolen the horse and the wagon. So Duke had already been kind of identified at this point, but I don't think they knew he was going to rob a train. So Duke being so young, he lacked having a good plan like older, more experienced bandits. So he failed to understand how heavy these strong boxes were for one horse to pull across the open prairie, which probably had some soft ground in places and required a heck of a lot of pulling by the horse. So after crossing the Big Blue River near Staplehurst, Nebraska, the horse had slowed to a walk, and then after about 2 miles, it just quit altogether. And Duke figured that he needed to steal a new horse. And since there were horses and ranches around, he figured he should be able to do that. So he unhitched his horse and he turned it loose. And it sounds like it didn't go very far, maybe just a couple 100 feet or a couple 100 yards, and started grazing on the prairie grasses, and then may have lie down to rest. So Duke was about to head to a ranch to see if he could steal a horse when he realized that it would be rather stupid to leave all of that gold in the back of the wagon while he was gone. So he figured that someone was liable to steal it if they came across the abandoned wagon. And Duke didn't have much for tools with him, but he had enough to manage to dig a hole about 20 yards from the wagon and bury the strong boxes and place some prairie grasses back over the top. So if you know anything about the Great Plains during the late 1800s, you know that they built many houses out of sod blocks. So they were very firm, stable blocks, and a lot of the roofs even had grasses growing from them. So Duke most likely had to cut through the sod and fold it back and then dig into the ground underneath to bury these boxes. And once buried, he placed these blocks of sod back over the top, and that concealed the location pretty well. So he figured he was now good to go find a fresh horse. So while Duke was in search of a horse, about 2 hours had passed, and the posse that was after him, including the sheriff, had been following his wagon tracks and got to the abandoned wagon. So at this point, they're puzzled. They're like, what the heck? Okay, so we get here, and there is an empty wagon. There's no horse. There's no outlaw. There's no strong boxes. So they searched the area, and they found that lame horse not too far from the wagon. So at that point, they figured that, okay, the outlaw is out looking for another horse, but where was the gold? So at this point, the sheriff and the posse, they divided up. Half of them retraced the trail back towards Lincoln to see if they missed something and if they could find a spot where Duke may have stopped and buried the loot. And the other half searched around the wagon for a while, and they found nothing. So one of the deputies from the posse, then he went ahead and hitched that horse back up to the wagon, and I guess at this point maybe the horse had rested for, 3 or 4 hours or something, so at this point maybe the horse was a little bit more fresh. So the deputy grabs the horse, he hitches him back up to the wagon, and he turns around and he follows his companions back towards Lincoln to look along the way also for the treasure, and that's what his half of the group did. So they followed up behind, looking to see if they could find anywhere that he may have stopped and buried the treasure. And I suppose at this point they thought they needed to get the horse and the wagon back towards Omaha. If it was stolen, it probably had to get returned to the proper owners. So anyhow, I'm sure the deputy was doing exactly that. So the deputy's in the wagon, and probably some of his posse members are in the wagon. They're getting pulled back towards Lincoln, probably going fairly slow. And they don't find any signs of any buried loot anywhere. So the next morning, Duke was caught in a farmer's barn putting a bridle on a horse. And in the confrontation, Duke pulled out his pistol and he shot at this farmer, and he hit him in the shoulder as he ran away towards his house. So this farmer, he got away, but he got injured, and he gets into his farmhouse. And Duke tried to be fast and tried to get away with the horse as quick as he could, but the farmer came out of the house with a shotgun and blasted Duke off of the horse. So as Duke had laid there with, I guess, loaded up with buckshot and dying, he explained to the farmer about the buried gold near the wagon that was abandoned down the road. And since at this point, though, the wagon was no longer there as a landmark, it seems that the treasure could still be anywhere and no one was ever able to find it. So it appears that it is still out there. Unless someone has found it, there hasn't been any news of it. It may be out there a couple miles west of Staplehurst, Nebraska, and today that $60,000 back then would be worth probably hundreds of thousands or more today. So that is the story of Duke Sherman, the young train robber that was a little too inexperienced in his planning to pull everything off perfectly, and his buried treasure may still be out there.